The first thing I noticed when I pulled up the gravel road was that the resort parking lot was full on a Tuesday afternoon in October. It was a detail that immediately felt wrong, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong box. This was the off-season, that quiet, liminal space between the vibrant gold of autumn and the first true powder of the skiing season. The sky was a heavy, bruised purple, signaling a storm that was still a few days out, and the air held a biting chill that usually sent tourists packing back toward the city. Yet, row after row of late-model SUVs and crossovers glittered under the dull sun. I shifted my truck into park, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate against my ribcage. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, just staring. The ski lifts stood like frozen skeletons against the mountainside, their cables motionless. Yet the resort was humming with energy that didn't belong to a closed facility. I stepped out of the cab, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots, a sound that felt strangely intrusive in the mountain silence. Looking up, I squinted at the massive wooden sign that arched over the entrance. Pine Ridge Mountain Resort. It was weathered, the edges of the timber beginning to fray from years of harsh winters and high-altitude UV exposure. Just beneath the main name, bolted into the wood with heavy iron hardware, was a smaller plank that read, "Owned and operated by Drew Gallagher." The paint was faded, a ghostly remnant of my uncle's pride. Drew had been gone for 5 years, taken by a sudden heart attack that left a hole in this community and a massive question mark over his estate. It had taken half a decade of grueling probate battles, mountain-sized stacks of paperwork, enough legal fees to buy a second property. But as of last Tuesday, this place was finally legally mine. I hadn't expected a homecoming party, but I certainly didn't expect a fully operational business. As I walked toward the main lodge, the reality of the situation began to sharpen. A group of kids, wrapped in bright neon puffers, were tossing sticks into the fire pit, while their parents sat nearby on Adirondack chairs, steaming mugs in hand. Laughter drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of burning cedar. I watched a couple dragging rolling suitcases toward one of the premium cabins, their faces lit with the excitement of vacation just beginning. Near Unit 3, a woman reached into a discreet black lockbox, pulled out a brass key, and disappeared inside. Every footstep I took felt heavier. My mind was racing through the legalities I had spent years studying. There was no management firm listed in the transition documents. There were no active leases. My uncle's bank accounts had been dormant for years. So, who the hell was checking these people in? Who was collecting the credit card numbers, cleaning the linens, and paying the electric bill? The lodge looked exactly as I remembered it, a sprawling masterpiece of stone and timber, but there was a polished, commercial sheen to it now that felt artificial. I headed straight for the administrative office, my pulse hammering in my throat. I pushed the heavy oak door open, and the familiar scent of old cedar and floor wax hit me, but it was overlaid with the clinical smell of industrial cleaner. The front desk was empty. A small, rusted bell sat on the counter next to a laminated sheet of paper that looked brand new. It wasn't a welcome sign. It was a list of emergency contacts. At the very top, in bold, aggressive lettering, it read, Karen Whitmore, HOA chairwoman. I stared at the name, trying to bridge the gap between a residential homeowners association and a private commercial resort. Before I could even reach for the bell, the rear office door banged open against the wall. A woman in her mid-50s marched out, her movements sharp and rehearsed. She had a severe bob haircut that looked like it had been trimmed with laser, and she clutched a heavy plastic clipboard against her chest like a riot shield. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward the window. "You can't park that truck there," she barked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That spot is strictly reserved for HOA board members, and we are expecting a full quorum this afternoon." I didn't move. I simply turned to face her, letting the silence stretch between us until her scowl began to flicker with a hint of uncertainty. "I'm the owner," I said. The words felt solid, a fact I had waited 5 years to say out loud. Karen's eyes flickered with a brief, sharp flash of confusion before settling into a look of deep-seated skepticism. She didn't offer a handshake or a welcome. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the clipboard and looked me up and down as if I were a stain on the lodge's pristine rug. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice dropping into a patronizing register. I didn't flinch. I introduced myself clearly, stating my name was Carson Gallagher and explaining that my uncle, Drew Gallagher, had left the property to me. I mentioned the probate closure and the legal transfer of the title that had been finalized only days prior. As the words hung in the air, Karen wrinkled her nose, a micro-expression of disgust that suggested I had just tracked something foul into her office. "Well, Mr. Gallagher," she began, her tone dripping with artificial professional concern, "I find that claim highly suspicious, to say the least. This resort has been under meticulous care and stewardship of the Pine Ridge HOA since Drew's unfortunate absence began. We stepped in when there was no one else." The word stewardship grated against my nerves like sandpaper. I looked past her at the glowing computer monitor on the desk, which showed a sophisticated booking calendar filled with color-coded blocks. "Care," I let out a dry, humorless laugh that seemed to startle her. "You mean you've been running a full-scale commercial operation on my land without a single phone call to the estate's attorneys?" "I saw the guests outside, Karen. I saw the lockboxes." She crossed her arms tightly, her clipboard now a barrier between us. She argued that the community couldn't simply let a landmark like Pine Ridge rot into the mountainside. According to her, the board had voted to assume management duties to prevent the pipes from freezing and the roofs from caving in. She spoke as if she were a martyr for the cause of property values, claiming that their interim management granted them a right to collect rents to cover the overhead. Her face twitched slightly when I stepped closer, closing the gap between the heir and the squatter. "You've been renting out my cabins for 5 years," I stated flatly, the weight of the realization settling into a cold anger in my gut. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, her composure wavering before she doubled down. She insisted that every penny went toward maintenance, insurance, and community functions, a vague term that usually meant whatever the board wanted it to mean. I didn't wait for her permission. Karen's eyes flickered with a brief, sharp flash of confusion before settling into a look of deep-seated skepticism. She didn't offer a handshake or a welcome. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the clipboard and looked me up and down as if I were a stain on the lodge's pristine rug. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice dropping into a patronizing register. I didn't flinch. I introduced myself clearly, stating my name was Carson Gallagher and explaining that my uncle, Drew Gallagher, had left the property to me. I mentioned the probate closure and the legal transfer of the title that had been finalized only days prior. As the words hung in the air, Karen wrinkled her nose, a micro-expression of disgust that suggested I had just tracked something foul into her office. "Well, Mr. Gallagher," she began, her tone dripping with artificial professional concern, "I find that claim highly suspicious, to say the least. This resort has been under meticulous care and stewardship of the Pine Ridge HOA since Drew's unfortunate absence began. We stepped in when there was no one else." The word stewardship grated against my nerves like sandpaper. I looked past her at the glowing computer monitor on the desk, which showed a sophisticated booking calendar filled with color-coded blocks. "Care," I let out a dry, humorless laugh that seemed to startle her. "You mean you've been running a full-scale commercial operation on my land without a single phone call to the estate's attorneys?" "I saw the guests outside, Karen. I saw the lockboxes." She crossed her arms tightly, her clipboard now a barrier between us. She argued that the community couldn't simply let a landmark like Pine Ridge rot into the mountainside. According to her, the board had voted to assume management duties to prevent the pipes from freezing and the roofs from caving in. She spoke as if she were a martyr for the cause of property values, claiming that their interim management granted them the right to collect rents to cover the overhead. Her face twitched slightly when I stepped closer, closing the gap between the heir and the squatter. "You've been renting out my cabins for 5 years," I stated flatly, the weight of the realization settling into a cold anger in my gut. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, her composure wavering before she doubled down. She insisted that every penny went toward maintenance, insurance, and community functions, a vague term that usually meant whatever the board wanted it to mean. I didn't wait for her permission. I reached behind the desk, my arm brushing past her as I grabbed a thick, leather-bound ledger that was sitting next to the keyboard. She made a panicked swipe for it, her manicured nails clicking against the cover. But I held a high and stepped back into the center of the room. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning columns of dates, names, and dollar amounts. The numbers were staggering. This record says you generated over $300,000 in gross rental income since 2018. I said, my voice rising to match the adrenaline surging through me. I looked her dead in the eye. That isn't stewardship, Karen. That's theft. It's organized, calculated theft. The air in the office grew stiflingly thin. Karen's face flushed a deep, mottled red, and her eyes narrowed until they were nothing more than cold slits of blue. You have no idea what you're getting into, Mr. Gallagher, she hissed, abandoning the facade of the helpful neighbor. She told me that while I might hold the deed to the dirt, the HOA owned the rules, the ordinances, and the very atmosphere of the mountain. She warned me that the community didn't take kindly to outsiders making threats. I leaned in until I could smell the faint, floral scent of her hairspray. I'm not an outsider, I whispered. I'm the person who owns the walls you're standing inside of, and you're going to hate what I do next. I tucked the ledger firmly under my arm, ignored her screeching protest to return board property, and walked out the door. As I climbed back into my truck, the engine's roar felt like a battle cry. I backed out of the reserved spot, throwing a cloud of gravel toward the lodge, and headed straight down the hill toward the sheriff's office. Karen might have spent 5 years building a kingdom on my uncle's grave, but she was about to learn that I didn't come here to negotiate. I came here to evict. I drove toward the sheriff's office with the heavy leather ledger sitting on the passenger seat like a live grenade. The realization of the scale of Karen's operation was still settling in, a cold weight in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't just some city guy who had stumbled into a windfall. I was a contractor who had spent 2 decades navigating the labyrinth of legal contracts, building codes, and site permits. I knew what a paper trail looked like, and I knew exactly how to spot a lie buried in the fine print. The sheriff's office was a squat, utilitarian brick building with a crooked flagpole out front, positioned halfway between the town square and the rugged base of Pine Ridge. It was a kind of place where time seemed to move slower, but the eyes of the law were sharper than they appeared. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. Deputy Elena Cruz sat behind a high front counter, her head bowed as she flipped through a thick case file. She didn't look up immediately, but I could feel her catalog in my presence, the sound of my boots, the way I breathed, the tension in my shoulders. When she finally raised her eyes, she spent exactly half a second taking me in. The mud-caked soles of my work boots, the dust from the lodge clinging to my jacket, and eyes that hadn't blinked since I had walked away from Karen Whitmore. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice mild but carrying the weight of authority. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I dropped the heavy ledger onto the counter with a hollow thud that echoed in the quiet room. "Deputy, I need to report financial misappropriation, unlawful property control, and quite possibly a massive case of tax fraud," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. I explained that I had 5 years' worth of rental income logs in that book. Money collected by an HOA that never possessed the legal authority to manage the property or act as a landlord. She raised an eyebrow, her interest sharpening as I mentioned the Gallagher name. "You're Drew's nephew," she noted, more of a statement than a question. It seemed my reputation, or at least my claim to the land, had reached the station before I did. She pulled the ledger toward her finger tracing the handwritten columns. Her brow furrowed as she saw the Pine Ridge HOA stamps on every booking entry. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum. "Follow me," she commanded. She led me to a cramped back room where the sheriff himself, Rick Mulleary, was hunched over a county map. Mulleary was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself, weathered skin, graying hair, and eyes that had seen every wind the ridge could throw at him. Elena handed him the ledger without a word. He skimmed the entries, his jaw tightening as he reached the most recent months. "You got proof of legal error?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I slid a manila folder onto the table containing the probate documents, notarized statements from the state executors, and a finalized title transfer. He read every single page with deliberate, agonizing slowness before finally meeting my gaze. "You plan to press charges?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. I want every cent back, Sheriff. And if they forge a single signature to keep the scheme running, I want to see it in the courtroom. Mullery nodded slowly, a grim shadow of a smile touching his face. He explained that we would start with a formal cease and desist, and he'd send Elena up to the resort immediately to shut down the rentals pending a full investigation. He warned me that while the sheriff's office would handle the criminal aspects of fraud, I would need to prepare for a civil suit to recover the back pay. I leaned forward, the wooden chair creaking under me. Check the county assessor's office, I suggested. I bet my life they filed fake paperwork to claim temporary custodianship after Drew died. Mullery looked at Elena. Get records from the assessor and cross-check every filing since 2018. I want to know who signed what, and I want to know when they did it. As the sheriff and Elena began their work, Mullery pointed me toward the county zoning board. If they've been using those cabins commercially without a valid permit, that's another violation for the pile, he said. I didn't need to be told twice. The zoning office was housed in a smaller, cramped building across the parking lot. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old ink. I met a jittery clerk named Theo, who looked like he had spent the last decade buried under paper. It took him 10 minutes of searching through a filing cabinet that groaned on its hinges before he pulled out the resort's master file. Theo laid the folder on a scarred wooden table and tapped a page near the back with a trembling finger. See here, he whispered, as if he were revealing a state secret. There's a conditional use permit issued in early 2019. It's signed by the HOA chairwoman, Karen Whitmore, but it's completely inconsistent with the original zoning ordinance for that plot. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the fine print. There was no indication that the permit had ever been reviewed or approved by the Board of Supervisors. When I asked who was listed as the official property owner on that application, Theo hesitated before pointing to a line at the bottom. It said, Community Trust, Pine Ridge HOA. That's not a legal entity we even recognize in this county, Theo admitted, looking increasingly alarmed. I pulled out my phone and took a high-resolution photo of the document. This wasn't just administrative overreach. It was documented fraud. They had created a phantom entity to bypass the fact that they didn't own the dirt. I thanked Theo and walked back out into the mountain air, which had turned sharp and dry. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones before a heavy snow hits. I drove back up the mountain, the engine of my truck straining against the incline. When I pulled into the resort lot, I saw two teenagers unloading heavy bags from a sedan near cabin 4. A handwritten welcome note was taped to the door, signed simply, Management. I snapped a photo of it just as a black SUV pulled in behind me. Deputy Cruz stepped out, her hand resting casually on her belt. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight up to the guests. I'm going to ask you to hold off on checking in, she said with a professional coldness. This property is currently under an active criminal investigation. The teenagers looked confused and a little frightened, but Elena was already moving toward the main lodge. Inside, I found Karen behind a desk, calmly rearranging brochures as if the world wasn't about to collapse on her. Karen Whitmore, Elena said, her voice echoing in the timber-framed lobby. I'm issuing a formal cease and desist on all commercial activity on this property, effective immediately. Karen stiffened, her face turning a pale, sickly white. On what grounds? She demanded, her voice shrill. Elena didn't blink. Unauthorized use of property, potential zoning violations, and misrepresentation of ownership. You have 72 hours to provide all financial records, contracts, and tax filings related to Pine Ridge Resort operations. Karen's hands curled into fists on the countertop. She tried to argue that the HOA had acted in the community's best interests, that the pipes would have burst and the roofs would have caved in without them. Elena cut her off. Your intentions aren't the issue here, Karen. Your authority is. And unless you can produce legal documentation proving your right to manage this property, you're facing serious consequences. I stood by the door, watching the woman who had spent 5 years stealing my uncle's legacy. You should have billed this estate for the repairs, I said, my voice low. You shouldn't have stolen the income. She didn't respond. She just stared at the desk, her empire of clipboards and ledgers turning into a prison of her own making. That night, I stayed in the lodge, the silence of the mountain finally reclaiming the halls. I booted up the ancient desktop in my uncle's old office and found a single file labeled HOA Agreement. I opened it. It was blank. No contract, no signatures, nothing. I backed it up to a USB stick, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The next morning, I met with Lee Raines at a roadside diner halfway up the mountain pass. Lee was a real estate litigator out of Denver with a reputation for being a shark in a designer blazer. She already had her laptop open and a steaming mug of black coffee at her elbow before I even sat down. She wore hiking boots with her suit, a silent testament to her readiness to trek through both courtrooms and mud to win a case. "This sounds like a textbook case of fiduciary overreach," she said, her eyes scanning the digital files I had sent her the night before. HOAs are notorious for stretching their authority in rural areas where they think oversight is thin, but this is industrial scale fraud. I sat back as the waitress dropped a plate of eggs in front of me. "What's our opening move?" I asked. Lee didn't hesitate. She explained that we were filing a multi-pronged civil suit for full restitution of every dollar they had collected since 2018, plus punitive damages for the unauthorized use of the land. But that was just the beginning. We were also filing a petition with the county to formally invalidate every permit and license issued under the community trust name. Once we push that through, Lee said, a sharp glint in her eyes, it strips away their civil shield. It opens the board members up to individual criminal liability for tax evasion, fraud, and possibly racketeering. I leaned over the table. "You think to go federal?" She nodded, tapping a finger on her screen. "If they use the internet or interstate phone lines to process these bookings, which they clearly did, that's wire fraud. And if they misrepresented the ownership of property to guests traveling across state lines, the DOJ is going to have a field day. With Sheriff Mallory already on board, we have the law enforcement foundation we need." By noon, the first round of legal volleys had been fired. I watched from the cab of my truck as process servers moved to the neighborhood, handing envelopes to the 4 other HOA board members. They looked like they'd been hit by a mountain landslide. Their faces pale as they realized a safe investment on my uncle's resort had just become a legal anchor. But Karen wasn't shaking. When I returned to the lodge that afternoon, I found a bright orange flyer taped to the front door. It read, "HOA emergency meeting tonight. Attendance mandatory. Resort future at stake." I ripped it down, crumpling the paper in my fist. They were still trying to spin the narrative, still trying to convince the neighbors that they were the victims. I checked the time. It was 7 p.m. I drove down to Community Center, a drafty wood frame building that smelled of floor wax and desperation. Inside, the board sat at a long folding table like a tribunal. Karen stood at a podium in the center, speaking into a crackling microphone about protective measures and maintaining continuity. I waited until she paused for a breath before stepping into the center aisle. The room went dead silent. "Is it true?" an older woman in the second row asked, her voice trembling. "Do we have the legal right to rent those cabins?" Karen's jaw tightened, her knuckles white as she gripped the podium. "That is a matter of ongoing administrative review," she began, her voice strained. I didn't let her finish. "It's already been reviewed," I announced, my voice carrying to the back of the hall. "You committed fraud. You filed for permits under a trust that doesn't exist and signed documents you knew were false." I walked to the front and dropped a copy of the fake zoning permit directly onto the table in front of the board members. "Every one of you signed this," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "You told these people you were protecting the resort, but you were actually using it as a private bank account. You spent their dues without oversight and lied about the ownership to keep the money flowing. That isn't stewardship. It's theft." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of a man in the back standing up. He was a local I recognized, a man who had lived on the ridge for 30 years. "I paid my dues for 5 years, thinking it went to the trails," he shouted, his face turning red. "Where's the money, Karen?" The room erupted into a cacophony of angry voices. Karen backed away from the mic, her eyes darting toward the side exit, but there was nowhere left to hide. The mountain had finally stopped listening to her. The following morning, the mountain air felt heavier as the physical weight of the brewing legal storm was pressing down on the pines. Lee Raines had set up a mobile command center in the lodge's dining hall. Her laptop connected to a portable scanner that whirred incessantly as she processed every scrap of paper we had recovered from the office. By 10 o'clock, she signaled me over, her expression grimmer than usual. "Carson, the rental income was just the tip of the iceberg," she said, tapping a pen against a spreadsheet. "We've started a forensic audit of the HOA's digital footprint, and it turns out they weren't just pocketing cash. They were leveraging your uncle's land to build a shadow empire." She showed me a series of bank transfers that bypassed the standard HOA operating account. The board had used the resort's consistent revenue to secure a revolving line of credit under a Shell LLC titled the Pine Ridge Community Fund. A quick search of the Secretary of State's database revealed that the entity had no formal registration, no articles of incorporation, and no listed agents. It was a phantom, a digital black hole designed to swallow capital. "They used the credit line to fund private ventures," Lee explained. "We're seeing payments to landscaping companies owned by board members' relatives and consulting fees that lead straight back to Karen's personal accounts. This is a textbook racketeering structure." I forwarded the digital trail to the district attorney's office, and within 3 hours, the first round of official subpoenas was authorized. By late afternoon, Lee had uncovered an even more brazen layer of the deception. It appeared the board had exploited my uncle's death to apply for a $42,000 state revitalization grant, claiming the resort was being converted into a low-income wilderness retreat. "They got the money in 2021, Lee noted, pointing to a dispersed check scan. "But there isn't a single new nail or a coat of paint on this property that accounts for 40 grand. The money moved into the Shell LLC and vanished within 6 months. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of bruised orange, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property. I needed to clear my head, but I also needed to see the resort through the eyes of a contractor, not an heir. I passed Cabin 10, a secluded unit near the trailhead, and stopped short. The back door featured a high-end electronic keypad lock, a sleek, brushed steel model that was completely out of place among the rustic hardware of the other units. I took a photo of the serial number, noting that it didn't appear on any of the maintenance logs I had seen in the ledger. The next morning, Deputy Cruz met me at the lodge, her expression tight. "We need you at the station, Carson. We found something you're going to want to see." We drove down the winding hill in silence. At the station, Sheriff Mallory led me to a dusty monitor in the back room. "We pulled the security footage from the lodge's exterior cameras for the last month," he said, hitting play. The grainy black and white video showed Karen's SUV pulling up to the rear entrance lawn after midnight. She emerged from the lodge 40 minutes later, struggling with a heavy, locked metal cash box and a thick, overstuffed accordion folder. "That folder matches a description of the one you reported missing from Drew's private safe," Mallory said, pausing the frame on Karen's strained face. "And that cash box? It's not logged in any HOA filing we've seized. We've secured a warrant for a primary residence on the East Ridge. We're going in this afternoon." I felt a strange mix of vindication and fury. Karen hadn't just been managing a resort. She'd been cannibalizing my family's history to fuel her own greed. As the sheriff coordinated the raid, I realized that the queen of the HOA hadn't just overstepped her bounds. She had turned my uncle's legacy into a criminal enterprise, and the walls were finally closing in. The raid on Karen Whitmore's East Ridge home began just as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across her manicured lawn. I watched from a distance as county investigators and IT specialists moved with practiced efficiency, carrying out towers of hard drives and plastic seal bags of documents. By sunset, the house had been turned inside out. They found the missing accordion folder tucked behind a false back in her cedar closet, my uncle's original tax documents, property receipts, and a series of private letters that had been missing since the day he died. But the real breakthrough didn't come from the paper. It came from the encrypted folders buried on her personal laptop. Lee Raines called me late that night, her voice buzzing with an intensity that told me the stakes had just shifted again. "Our forensic guy cracked the primary vault on the hard drive, Carson. It's a hidden ledger, separate from anything she showed the board. She wasn't just skimming. She was funneling. Lee explained that Karen had been moving blocks of cash into a personal account at a small credit union in Utah, far outside the jurisdiction of our local banks. Over 4 years, she had siphoned off nearly $98,000 in untraceable side payments. She was preparing an exit strategy, Lee added. This wasn't just a local power trip. This was a long-term embezzlement scheme. The next morning, I sat with Sheriff Mullery on the lodge porch, the wood fire in the nearby pit crackling in the sharp morning air. He handed me a heavy manila folder, the formal filing from the district attorney. The charges were a laundry list of high-level felonies: wire fraud, tax evasion, theft by deception, and tampering with public records. The state grant is what's going to sink her, Mullery said, leaning back in his chair. That's public money. The feds are officially circling now, and once the Office of the Inspector General gets involved, there's no room for negotiation. I stared out at the quiet cabins, their windows dark and empty. The resort felt like a ghost town, stripped of its false life and waiting to be reborn. Did you know her before all this? I asked, looking at Mullery. He sighed, watching the mist roll down the granite peaks. She used to run the town library. She was organized, sharp, and helpful. But something shifted after Drew passed. I've seen it before in these small mountain towns. Power does strange things to people when they realize no one is looking over their shoulder. She started thinking the resort was her reward for living here so long. He stood up, adjusting his belt. She's going to try to flip on the other board members to get a lighter sentence, but with a federal interest, she's looking at 15 years minimum. I spent the afternoon preparing for a public town hall. I refused to let the HOA control the narrative any longer. I drafted flyers and posted them at the post office, the grocery store, and the trailhead. No secret meetings, no exclusive quorums. Just an open invitation for everyone who had been affected by the board's deception. I spent hours in Drew's office, looking at his old blueprints and sketches for the resort. He had envisioned a place that belonged to the mountain, not a place that exploited it. I realized then that my job wasn't just to recover the money. It was to recover the integrity of the Gallagher name. That evening, as the first few locals began to trickle into the community center, Lee pulled me aside. She looked unusually pale. Carson, we found an unsigned deed transfer in the safe we seized from Karen's house. It was dated 3 months after your uncle died. She showed me a digital scan on her tablet. Someone had attempted to transfer the entire resort title into the HOA's name retroactively. The signature lines were blank, but the notary stamp at the bottom was a blatant forgery, a template printed from a cheap online site. This is interstate intent to defraud, Lee whispered. The FBI is reviewing it as we speak. This isn't just a local scandal anymore. This is a federal crime scene. The investigation took a chilling turn when a federal agent named Keene arrived from the Department of Justice. He wasn't interested in the missing rental income or the forged notary stamps. He sat me down in the lodge and presented a grainy security still from 3 years prior. It showed a man in a red ski jacket, his face partially obscured by goggles, checking in at the front desk after hours. This is Alan Riley, Keene explained. He was a high-level whistleblower in a regional racketeering case involving land development. He disappeared the same night this footage was recorded. My blood ran cold as the puzzle pieces clicked into place. The HOA hadn't just been skimming money. They had been using the resort's isolation to operate a black site for off-grid guests who needed to vanish. There was no guest record for Riley, no credit card trail, and no digital footprint. However, the forensic audit of the Shell LLC revealed a massive influx of cash that same week. Money traced back to a private security firm with ties to the very people Riley was set to testify against. They hadn't just stolen my uncle's money. They had sold his privacy to the highest bidder. Faced with the evidence of her involvement in a federal disappearance, Karen's resolve finally shattered. She signed a 43-page confession in exchange for a move to a lower security facility. She detailed how the community fund had been used to facilitate special accommodations for high-paying, anonymous clients, proving that the board had turned the resort into a hub for interstate criminal activity. With the federal investigation concluded and the board members indicted, the heavy cloud of corruption finally lifted from the mountain. I stood before the townspeople at a final meeting. not as a litigator or a victim, but as the steward my uncle wanted me to be. I announced that the resort would no longer be called Pine Ridge. That name had been stained by Karen's greed and the shadows of the last 5 years. From that day forward, it would be Gallagher Pines. We launched a transparent cooperative, where every local employee had a stake in the success of the business, and every ledger was open for public review. There would be no more secret meetings and no more hidden trusts. The final settlement was a landslide of justice. The court awarded the estate the full $300,000 in diverted rental income plus interest, all of which was seized from the liquidated assets of the disgraced board members. I used the funds to repay the $42,000 estate, grand in full, clearing my family's name with the government. The remaining capital was funneled into a community scholarship fund and a massive restoration project for the local hiking trails that the HOA had tried to wall off. We held a quiet ceremony outside Cabin 9, planting a single, resilient pine tree in memory of Alan Riley, ensuring that the truth would finally have a place to grow where lies had once been buried. As the first day of June arrived, the mountain air was sweet with the scent of pine and fresh possibilities. I sat on the refinished deck of my uncle's cabin, watching a new generation of families pull into the parking lot. The books were balanced, the permits were legal, and the legacy was secure. I had spent months fighting through a forest of fraud, but as the sun climbed over the peaks, the light hit the new sign at the entrance, turning the gold leaf to fire. Justice wasn't just a verdict handed down in a Denver courtroom. It was a quiet, steady hum of a mountain resort finally running on the truth. I took a sip of my coffee and looked up at the lifts, ready for the first time to let the mountain belong to the people again.